The name you've never heard isn't always the one you should fear the most. While Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer dominate the headlines, there are killers who operated in the shadows, leaving behind trails of blood that would make even seasoned detectives lose sleep. These aren't the names that sell books or get turned into Netflix documentaries. These are the monsters who perfected their craft in silence, who slipped through the cracks of justice, who proved that evil doesn't always come with a recognizable face. Today, we're diving into the darkest corners of criminal history to uncover 5 serial killers whose names should terrify you but probably don't. Each one represents a different kind of nightmare. A mechanic who turned Oregon's forests into his personal dumping ground. A teacher who used trust as his deadliest weapon. A taxi driver who collected trophies in glass jars. A drifter who rode the rails to find his victims. And a security guard who posed his kills like twisted art installations. What makes these cases so disturbing isn't just the body count, it's the methodical precision, the calculated patience, the way they blended into society while secretly orchestrating some of the most horrific crimes you've never heard of. By the end of this deep dive, you'll understand why these 5 names deserve to be spoken in the same breath as the monsters we already know. Let's start in the Pacific Northwest, where the forest of Oregon became hunting grounds for a man who seemed like nothing more than an ordinary small engine mechanic. Dayton Leroy Rogers was born on September 30th, 1953, into what appeared to be a perfectly normal American life. He grew up, got married, had a child, and settled into the routine of fixing lawnmowers and chainsaws for a living. His neighbors knew him as quiet, hardworking, maybe a little stressed about money, but nothing that would raise any red flags. What they didn't know was that Rogers had developed a taste for something far darker than anyone could imagine. Addicts desperately searching for their next fix. Sex workers trying to survive another night. Runaways with nowhere else to turn. These were society's most vulnerable, the ones whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger massive search parties or media attention. Rogers understood this calculation perfectly. His method was chillingly simple. He'd cruise the streets in his pickup truck, looking for women who needed money, needed drugs, needed help. He'd offer them work, offer them a ride, offer them whatever they needed to hear to get into his vehicle. From there, he'd drive them to secluded areas deep in the forest outside Malala, Oregon. What happened next was systematic brutality. Rogers would tie his victims up using rope or wire, ensuring they couldn't escape or fight back. Then he'd kill them, often using knives or other sharp instruments. But Rogers wasn't satisfied with just murder. He had rituals, patterns that revealed the depth of his psychological disturbance. After killing his victims, he would often dismember their bodies, making disposal easier and identification more difficult. The Malala Forest became Rogers' personal graveyard. But the forensic evidence that ultimately connected Rogers to these crimes was as sophisticated as it was damning. Investigators found serology evidence, blood from the knife used to kill victims, and bloodstains found in Rogers' pickup truck. Fabric and shoe analysis matched victim clothing to burned remains found in Rogers' wood stove at home. Tool marks on victim bones matched perfectly to Rogers' hacksaw. Hair analysis connected victims' hair to samples found in his truck. The web of physical evidence was overwhelming, painting a picture of a man who had turned murder into a routine. Rogers had one particularly disturbing habit that would eventually help investigators connect him to the crimes. He would pour mini bottles of vodka into orange juice bottles to make himself screwdrivers while he committed his acts of violence. This signature detail appeared at multiple crime scenes, creating a pattern that investigators couldn't ignore. But Rogers' downfall came when he made a critical error. On a bright day in broad daylight, he attacked Jennifer Lisa Smith in a parking lot off Southeast McLaughlin Boulevard in Oak Grove. Unlike his previous victims, who disappeared into the forest, this attack happened where people could see. Rogers stabbed Jennifer 11 times in the breasts, abdomen, and back while she sat in his truck. When she fell to the ground, witnesses immediately sprang into action. Several people ran to their cars, trying to block Rogers' vehicle in the parking lot. But Rogers wasn't finished. He drove over landscaping, heading south on Southeast McLaughlin at speeds reaching 100 miles per hour. One witness followed him through Milwaukee, Gladstone, Oregon City, and Canby, maintaining pursuit even as Rogers desperately tried to escape. When Rogers finally pulled into a driveway, the following driver took down the address, found a phone, and reported everything to police. That single act of courage cracked the case wide open. When investigators arrived at Rogers' home, they found evidence linking him to multiple murders. In May 1989, Rogers was convicted for the murders of Lisa Marie Mock, age 23, Maureen Ann Hodges, age 26, Christine Lotus Adams, age 35, Cynthia DeVore, age 20, Nandes Cervantes, age 26, and Rayatha Giles, just 16 years old. Rogers was sentenced to death, but his case became a legal nightmare that dragged on for decades. The Oregon Supreme Court vacated his death sentence and remanded his case for new trials not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. Each time, juries again imposed the death penalty. But on November 12, 2021, his death sentence was overturned for the 4th time. Then in December 2022, Governor Kate Brown commuted all death sentences in Oregon to life without parole. Today, Dayton Leroy Rogers sits in Two Rivers Correctional Institution in Umatilla, Oregon. He's now 70 years old, a grandfather figure who once turned Oregon's beautiful forests into scenes of unimaginable horror. His case demonstrates how someone can hide in plain sight, living a double life that nobody suspects until it's far too late. But Rogers represents just one type of predator. Our next killer used a completely different approach, one that exploited hope instead of desperation. In the South Indian state of Karnataka, between 2003 and 2009, young women began disappearing in a pattern that would eventually reveal one of India's most calculating serial killers. The man responsible seemed like an unlikely monster. He was educated, well-spoken, and held a respectable position as a primary school teacher in Bantwal, Dakshina Kannada district. His real name was Mohan Kumar, but the media would eventually know him as Cyanide Mohan for reasons that become clear once you understand his method of operation. Kumar's approach was built on manipulation and false hope. He specifically targeted vulnerable young women from poor backgrounds or desperate situations, women who were looking for marriage and a chance at a better life. In Indian society, marriage represents security, respectability, and escape from poverty. Kumar understood this desperation and weaponized it. His technique was methodical and cruel. Kumar would contact unmarried women, usually from Dakshina Karnataka and Kasaragod in Kerala, using different fake names and identities. He would promise them jobs, marriage, and a bright future together. Over time, he would build emotional relationships with these women, gaining their complete trust and dependency. The next phase of his plan involved convincing these women to elope with him, effectively cutting them off from their families and support systems. Kumar created elaborate fictional backgrounds for himself, claiming to hold high social status and promising his victims a life of comfort and respect. Once isolated from their families, these women were completely vulnerable. Kumar's final act was perhaps the most sinister part of his entire operation. He would take his victims to lodges near bus stands in different locations. After sexually assaulting them, he would convince them to take what he claimed were contraceptive pills. In reality, these were cyanide tablets that would kill them within minutes. Kumar's method of administering the poison was particularly calculated. He would convince his victims to take the pills in restroom facilities, then wait outside for approximately 30 minutes. Once he was certain they had died, he would collect all their possessions, jewelry, and mobile phones, then simply leave. The bodies would eventually be discovered, but often without identification, treated as unnatural deaths rather than murders. This pattern continued for years without detection because Kumar had perfected the art of covering his tracks. He would sell or melt down stolen jewelry, giving some pieces to his wife and mother who lived in Rodeo, Durango, Mexico. He used his victims' mobile phones to contact and groom his next targets, creating a cycle of death that seemed impossible to break. The case that finally brought Kumar down involved a 22-year-old woman named Anitha who disappeared in June 2009. Her body was found at a bus stand and buried without being identified. Police initially treated it as another unnatural death, but Anitha's family refused to give up searching for her. The breakthrough came when investigators traced calls from Anitha's phone back to Kumar's residence in a village near Mangalore. When they searched his home, they discovered a horrifying collection of evidence. Anitha's jewelry was there, along with several mobile phones belonging to other victims and 8 cyanide tablets ready for future use. On October 21st, Kumar was apprehended. Following his arrest, police reopened the cases of 17 missing girls and eventually connected him to at least 20 murders. Kumar confessed to his crimes, admitting that he had befriended women with offers of marriage, then killed them with cyanide before stealing their possessions. Kumar was initially sentenced to death for Anitha's murder in 2013, but in 2017, the Karnataka High Court commuted his execution sentence to life imprisonment. Today, he remains in prison, a former teacher who used education and respectability as camouflage for one of India's most systematic killing sprees. What makes Kumar's case particularly disturbing is how he exploited cultural expectations and social vulnerabilities. These weren't random killings driven by rage or psychosis. They were carefully planned operations that treated human lives as disposable resources in a twisted business model. Our next killer lurked in the shadows of Los Angeles during one of the city's most violent periods. While 3 separate serial killers terrorized the streets, Michael Herbert Hughes stood out for one chilling reason. He didn't just kill his victims, he posed them like twisted art pieces for whoever would find them first. Los Angeles in the late 1980s and early 1990s was a war zone. The crack epidemic had torn through the city like wildfire, forcing desperate women onto the streets to feed their addictions. As many as 90 women were murdered in inner city Los Angeles during this period, their bodies dumped in alleys, parking lots, and abandoned buildings. But Hughes wasn't just another predator hunting vulnerable prey. He was something far more calculated, far more disturbing. Born in Michigan in 1958, Hughes's childhood was marked by abandonment from the very beginning. His father vanished when he was still young, leaving his mother to raise him and his sister alone. By age 5, they had moved to California, where Hughes would spend the rest of his life drifting between legitimate work and the criminal underworld. After a stint in the Navy, he returned to Los Angeles, living on the streets, selling drugs, and making connections in the city's underbelly. What separated Hughes from the other killers stalking South Los Angeles wasn't just his method of murder, it was what he did afterward. Hughes would carefully arrange his victims in provocative, disturbing positions, turning each crime scene into a macabre display designed to maximize the psychological impact on whoever discovered them. His first confirmed victim was Teresa Ballard, 26 years old, found in Jesse Owens County Park on September 23, 1992. Her body had been positioned with deliberate care, staged in a way that made the discovery even more traumatic for the person who found her. But this was just the beginning of Hughes's twisted gallery. Over the next year, 3 more women would fall victim to his calculated brutality. Brenda Bradley, 38 years old, Terry Miles, 33, and Jamie Harrington, 29, were all found dumped in alleys in a Culver City commercial area. Each had been strangled, each had been posed, and each discovery sent shockwaves through the already terrified community. But Hughes made a fatal error with his final victim, one that would ultimately lead to his capture. On November 14, 1993, an eyewitness spotted something that would haunt them forever. A man pushing a shopping cart through a Culver City parking lot with a woman's body secured to it with ropes and torn cloth. That man was Michael Hughes, and that witness would become the key to finally stopping his reign of terror. The witness didn't just see Hughes dispose of the body. They followed him. They watched as he pushed the cart, left Jamie Harrington's corpse in the parking lot, and then walked away as if nothing had happened. When police arrived, they found Hughes's fingerprints all over the shopping cart. Those same prints would later connect him to 2 other murders, while paperwork with his name on it linked him to the 4th. What made Hughes particularly dangerous was his ability to blend into the background of Los Angeles's gritty landscape. He worked odd jobs: security guard, Christmas tree salesman near LAX, various manual labor positions. To most people, he was just another face in the crowd, another working class guy trying to get by. Nobody suspected that behind that ordinary facade was a man who turned murder into performance art. The investigation revealed the full scope of Hughes's calculated cruelty. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was planned, methodical, designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on everyone involved, from the victims to the people who found them. In 1998, Hughes was convicted and sentenced to life without parole for the murders of Teresa Ballard, Brenda Bradley, Terry Miles, and Jamie Harrington. But the story didn't end there. DNA evidence, a technology that was just beginning to revolutionize criminal investigations, would soon connect Hughes to even more murders. The DNA results painted a picture of a killer who had been operating much longer than anyone realized. 15-year-old Yvonne Coleman, murdered on January 22nd, 1986. Her body was found in a park in Inglewood, California. Verna Williams, 36, discovered in a stairwell on May 26, 1986. Deborah Jackson, 32, found on June 25, 1993. All connected to Hughes through the microscopic evidence he left behind. In November 2011, Hughes was convicted of these additional murders and sentenced to death in June 2012. The man who had turned killing into a twisted art form would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Today, at 67 years old, he remains on death row at High Desert State Prison in Susanville, California, according to records from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Hughes represents something particularly disturbing in the world of serial killers, the performer. While other killers might hide their crimes, Hughes wanted his discovered. He wanted people to be shocked, horrified, traumatized by what they found. Each crime scene was a message, a declaration that he had the power to not just take life, but to orchestrate how that death would be remembered. Meanwhile, halfway around the world in Hong Kong, another killer was operating with an entirely different but equally disturbing methodology. Lam Kor Wan wasn't interested in shocking strangers with his crime scenes. He was interested in something far more personal, far more intimate, and far more grotesque. Lam Kor Wan was born in British Hong Kong on May 22, 1955, as Lam Kwok Yue. His childhood was marked by violence and isolation that would shape the monster he would become. Growing up in Malaysia, his father regularly beat both him and his mother. One beating was so severe that young Lam was knocked unconscious. The physical abuse only stopped when the family moved to Hong Kong during Lam's teenage years, but the psychological damage had already been done. At school, Lam struggled to make friends. He was a loner whose closest companion was an electronic chess set. As an adult, he got a job as a taxi driver and deliberately chose to work the night shift because it suited his increasingly antisocial temperament. He continued living in the family home in To Kwa Wan, sharing a room with his younger brother, who had no idea what darkness was growing in the person sleeping just feet away. Lam had never had a girlfriend. In the late 1970s, he began secretly collecting pornographic magazines that he ordered from Britain because he was too embarrassed to buy them in person. He kept this collection locked away in a metal ammunition box, hidden from his family. But simply looking at the magazines wasn't enough. He began rephotographing the images, turning his obsession into a more active pursuit. The escalation was gradual but inevitable. Lam bought a Polaroid camera and began taking pictures of women from under toilet cubicle doors. When the women noticed and chased him down the streets, he grew tired of running. He needed something new, something more satisfying. That something would soon become murder. On February 3rd, 1982, Lam's life crossed a line from which there would be no return. He picked up a passenger named Chan Fung Lan at about 4 a.m. She had just finished work at the Chinese Palace nightclub in Sim Sha Tsui and was heavily intoxicated. During the ride, she asked him to stop the car so she could vomit. After throwing up, she asked to be taken back to Sim Sha Tsui, then changed her mind again a few minutes later. That final change of mind was the trigger Lam had been waiting for. He snapped. He stopped the car, took an electrical wire, and strangled the drunk woman to death. But what happened next reveals the true depth of his depravity. Lam drove home with the dead body still in his car, then dragged it into his flat past the sleeping security guard. He kept the corpse under his sofa until his family left for work the next morning. Then, on his plastic-covered bedroom floor, he used an electric saw to dismember her body while photographing every step of the process. He wrapped the body parts and threw them into the Xingmen River. A week later, news reports began appearing about body parts washing up on riverbanks, but police couldn't identify the victim or the killer. For Lam, this was just the beginning. He shared his bedroom with his brother, who remained completely unaware of the horrors taking place during the day while he was at work. Lam's night shift schedule gave him the perfect cover to dismember victims at home without his family discovering his activities. But Lamb's true depravity went beyond just murder and dismemberment. He earned the nickname Jar's Murderer because he carefully preserved his victims' genitalia in jars filled with formaldehyde. This wasn't random violence or crimes of passion. This was a systematic collection, a grotesque museum of his victims that he kept as trophies. The investigation that would eventually capture Lam was as methodical as his crimes were brutal. After months of police work, he was finally arrested on August 18, 1982, by two plainclothes officers acting on a tip from a photo technician at a Kodak shop. The photographs that Lam had been taking during his murders had finally betrayed him. When police searched his home, they found the evidence that would seal his fate: the jars containing preserved body parts, photographs documenting his crimes, and the tools he used to dismember his victims. The case was so shocking that a female forensic scientist was removed from the investigation, and only men were allowed to serve on the jury. Lam was initially sentenced to death, but the sentence was later reduced to life imprisonment without parole by the then Hong Kong governor. Today, he is serving his sentence at the maximum security Shek Pik prison on Lantau Island, where he remains one of Hong Kong's most notorious criminals. The contrast between Hughes and Lam illustrates the different ways that evil can manifest. Hughes was a performer who wanted his crimes to be discovered and to shock those who found them. Lam was a collector who wanted to keep his victims with him forever, preserving parts of them in his private museum of death. Both were predators who targeted vulnerable people, but their motivations and methods reveal the disturbing variety of human darkness. These cases remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it drives a taxi through the night streets of Hong Kong. Sometimes it works security jobs near LAX. Sometimes it shares a bedroom with a brother who never suspects. Now we move to our third killer, someone whose story proves that evil can hide behind the most respectable facades. Mohan Kumar wasn't a drifter or an outcast. He wasn't living on society's margins like so many predators do. He was a teacher, educated, well-spoken, the kind of man parents trusted with their children. But behind that polished exterior was a calculating monster who turned hope itself into a weapon. Born in the coastal district of Dakshina Kannada in Karnataka, India, Mohan Kumar seemed destined for an ordinary life. He completed his education, became a primary school teacher, and by all appearances was a contributing member of society. His colleagues knew him as dedicated and professional. His students saw him as patient and kind. But there was something festering beneath that carefully constructed image, something dark that would eventually consume everything around him. In 2003, Kumar began what would become one of India's most methodical killing sprees. His victims weren't random. They weren't crimes of passion or opportunity. Kumar had identified the perfect prey, young women from poor backgrounds, women desperate for a better life, women who had little support and fewer options. He understood their vulnerabilities better than they understood them themselves. Kumar's method was as cruel as it was calculated. He would approach these women with promises of marriage, presenting himself as a catch, a educated man with a stable job who could offer them security and respectability. In a society where marriage was often a woman's only path to economic stability, Kumar's offers seemed like answered prayers. He would use different names, create elaborate backstories, and present himself as someone of higher social standing than he actually was. But this wasn't just about deception. Kumar was a master manipulator who understood exactly how to exploit desperation. He would court these women over weeks or months, building genuine emotional connections, making them fall in love not just with the promise of a better life, but with him personally. He would isolate them from their families, convincing them to elope, to cut ties with anyone who might protect them or ask questions. Once he had them completely alone and dependent on him, Kumar would suggest they travel together to register their marriage or meet his family. They would end up at bus stations in unfamiliar towns, far from anyone who knew them. And that's where the nightmare would begin. Kumar carried cyanide tablets with him, deadly poison that he had somehow acquired and kept for his twisted purpose. He would convince his victims to take what he claimed were contraceptive pills, telling them it was necessary before they consummated their marriage. These desperate women, trusting the man they believed loved them, would swallow the pills without question. Then Kumar would wait. He would send them into public restrooms, at bus stations, knowing they would collapse within minutes. The cyanide would work quickly, causing excruciating pain before death. Kumar would wait exactly 30 minutes, timing it perfectly, before entering to check that they were dead. Then he would strip them of their jewelry, their phones, any valuables they had, and simply walk away. This wasn't crimes of passion or sudden violence. This was industrial-scale murder, cold and efficient. Kumar didn't just kill these women, he erased them. Many of their bodies were never properly identified, buried as unknown casualties in a system that barely kept track of the poor and dispossessed. Their families often didn't even know they were dead, thinking they had simply eloped and would return someday. For 6 years, Kumar repeated this pattern. The exact number of his victims may never be known, but he confessed to killing at least 20 women. 20 lives snuffed out not for money, though he did steal their belongings, but for the sick satisfaction of having complete power over another human being. He enjoyed the process, the manipulation, the moment when he convinced them to take the poison, the wait as it took effect. What made Kumar particularly dangerous was his ability to learn and adapt. He would use his victims' phones to contact his next target, building credibility by having references from previous women who had supposedly found happiness with him. It was a perfect system, each murder making the next one easier, each dead woman becoming bait for the next. The investigation that eventually brought Kumar down began with a 22-year-old woman named Anitha who disappeared in June 2009. Unlike his previous victims, Anitha had people who noticed when she didn't come home. Her body was found at a bus station, initially treated as an unexplained death, but her family pushed for answers. The breakthrough came when police traced calls made from Anitha's phone after her death. The trail led them to Kumar's village near Mangalore, and when they searched his home, they found a treasure trove of evidence. Jewelry from multiple victims, several mobile phones, and most damning of all, 8 cyanide tablets ready for his next murder. Under interrogation, Kumar didn't show remorse or try to minimize his crimes. He methodically described his method, explaining how he would befriend unmarried women from Dakshina Karnataka and Kasaragod in Kerala, using different names and promising jobs and marriage. He detailed how he would sexually assault them in lodge rooms near bus stations before convincing them to take the cyanide pills he claimed were contraceptives. The scope of his crimes was staggering. Police reopened cases of 17 missing women, finding connections to Kumar in case after case. The pattern was always the same: vulnerable women who had disappeared after meeting a charming, educated man who promised them a better life. Kumar was initially sentenced to death for Anitha's murder in 2013, but in 2017, the Karnataka High Court commuted his sentence to life imprisonment. He remains in prison today, a man who turned society's most basic human need, the desire for love and security, into a weapon of mass destruction. What makes Kumar's story so disturbing isn't just the number of victims or the coldness of his method. It's how he exploited the very systems meant to protect these women. He used their family's desire to see them married and settled. He used their society's emphasis on finding a good husband. He used their own hopes and dreams against them, turning their greatest aspirations into the mechanism of their destruction. Kumar represents something particularly insidious in the world of serial killers. He wasn't driven by sexual sadism or psychological breaks from reality. He was a predator who had identified a perfect hunting ground and perfected his technique over years of practice. He understood that in a world where women have limited options, offering hope can be more powerful than any weapon. The women Kumar killed weren't just statistics. They were daughters, sisters, friends who had dreams of better lives, who trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. They died believing they were about to start new chapters in their lives, never knowing they had encountered a monster who saw their hope as weakness to be exploited. Today, Kumar sits in prison, his killing spree finally ended. But his story serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it comes with a smile, a promise, and the offer of everything you've ever wanted. Now, let's dive into one of the most disturbing cases you've probably never heard of, the story of Lam Kor Wan, Hong Kong's first serial killer, a man so methodical and grotesque in his crimes that he shocked even seasoned investigators. In the early 1980s, Hong Kong was experiencing rapid growth and change. The bustling streets of this British colony were filled with opportunity, but beneath the surface, something truly sinister was stirring. Women were disappearing from the nightlife districts, and when their bodies were discovered, the scenes were so horrific that female forensic scientists were removed from the case. Only male investigators were allowed to examine the evidence, and only men could serve on the jury when the killer was finally brought to trial. The man responsible for these nightmarish crimes was Lam Korwan, a quiet taxi driver who worked the night shift. Born on May 22nd, 1955, as Lam Kwok Yue, he would later change his name when he officially became a cab driver in 1978. This wasn't just any ordinary serial killer. Lam earned the chilling nickname the Jar's Murderer because of his twisted habit of preserving his victims' genitalia in formaldehyde-filled jars, like some kind of macabre trophy collection. What made Lam particularly terrifying wasn't just the brutality of his crimes, but how he managed to hide in plain sight. He was the perfect predator, a night shift taxi driver with access to vulnerable women, a man who could move freely through the city without suspicion, and someone who had perfected the art of making people disappear. Lam's childhood was a nightmare that would shape the monster he became. Growing up in Malaysia, he endured horrific abuse at the hands of his father, who would beat both him and his mother with such violence that young Lam was once knocked unconscious. The family eventually moved to Hong Kong when Lam was a teenager, but the damage was already done. He had trouble making friends at school, and his electronic chess set became his closest companion, a telling sign of the isolation that would define his entire life. As an adult, Lam remained a loner. He had never had a girlfriend, never formed meaningful connections with anyone. He lived in the family home in To Kwa Wan, sharing a room with his younger brother, but even within his own family, he was a stranger. What his family didn't know was that he was secretly amassing a collection of pornographic magazines that he ordered from Britain, too embarrassed to buy them locally. He kept this stash locked away in a metal ammunition box, hidden from everyone around him. But looking at pictures and magazines wasn't enough for Lam. His desires escalated, and he began taking more risks. He bought a Polaroid camera and started sneaking into women's restrooms, photographing them from under toilet cubicle doors. When women noticed and chased him through the streets, he grew tired of running. He was searching for something more, something that would give him the ultimate control he craved. That something revealed itself on February 3rd, 1982, in the most horrific way possible. Lam picked up a passenger named Chan Fung Lan at around 4 a.m. She had just finished work at the Chinese Palace nightclub in Sim Sha Tsui and was heavily intoxicated. During the ride, she asked him to stop so she could vomit, then changed her destination multiple times in her drunken state. For Lam, this was the moment when his fantasy became reality. Something inside him snapped. He stopped the car, grabbed an electrical wire, and strangled Chan Fung Lan to death. But what happened next reveals the calculated, methodical nature of this monster. He didn't panic, didn't try to dump the body quickly. Instead, he drove home with the corpse still in his car, then dragged it into his flat past the sleeping security guard. The details of what Lam did next are almost too disturbing to comprehend. He kept the body under his sofa until his family left for work the next morning. Then, he laid her body on his plastic-covered bedroom floor and used an electric saw to dismember her. But here's what makes this even more chilling. He photographed everything. Every cut, every step of the process was documented like some twisted scientific experiment. He wrapped the body parts and threw them into the Xingmen River. A week later, when news reports surfaced about body parts washing up on the riverbanks, no one could identify the victim or the killer. Lam had committed the perfect crime, and he knew it. What's particularly disturbing is how Lam managed to continue his normal life while committing these horrific acts. He shared his bedroom with his brother, who had no idea what was happening just feet away from where he slept. Lam worked the night shift, which gave him the perfect cover. He could dismember victims during the day while his family was at work, then dispose of the evidence using his taxi to transport body parts to remote locations in the New Territories and Hong Kong Island. For months, Lam continued his killing spree, perfecting his method with each victim. The crimes were so well planned and executed that police had no leads, no suspects, and no idea they were dealing with Hong Kong's first serial killer. The bodies were eventually located, but the killer remained a ghost, moving through the city undetected. But like so many criminals before him, Lam's arrogance would eventually be his downfall. On August 18th, 1982, he made a fatal mistake. He had been taking his gruesome photographs to a local Kodak shop for development, and a photo technician noticed something disturbing in the images. The technician contacted police, and within days, officers had traced the photos back to Lam. When police arrested him, they found a man who showed no remorse, no shock at being caught. He was calm, almost relieved that his secret was finally out. The brother, who had shared a room with Lam throughout the killing spree, was initially considered a suspect, but investigators quickly determined that Lam had acted alone. The psychological isolation that had defined his entire life extended even to his crimes. Lam Korwan was originally sentenced to death, but this was later commuted to life imprisonment without parole by the Hong Kong governor. Today, at 68 years old, he remains imprisoned at the maximum security Shek Pik prison on Lantau Island, where he will spend the rest of his life. The case of Lam Korwan represents something uniquely terrifying in the world of serial killers, the collector. Unlike killers who are driven by rage or sexual gratification, Lam was methodical, organized, and driven by a need to possess and preserve. His victims weren't just people he killed, they were specimens to be cataloged, photographed, and kept as trophies in jars of formaldehyde. What makes his story even more chilling is how easily he blended into society. He was just another taxi driver, working the night shift, living with his family, seemingly harmless. But beneath that ordinary exterior was a mind so twisted and calculating that it took months of careful police work to finally bring him to justice. The Lam Korwan case forever changed how Hong Kong viewed personal safety and trust. The idea that someone so ordinary, someone you might casually interact with during a taxi ride, could be capable of such calculated evil shattered the sense of security that many people took for granted. It proved that monsters don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they're the quiet ones, the ones who blend into the background, the ones who seem too ordinary to be dangerous. And perhaps, most terrifyingly of all, Lam Korwan showed us that some people don't kill in moments of passion or desperation. Some people kill because they want to, because they've found something in the act of taking life that fulfills them in ways that normal human connection never could. Our fourth killer is Lam Korwan, and his case reveals something genuinely disturbing about how serial killers can hide in plain sight for years. On the surface, he seemed like any other taxi driver in Hong Kong, quiet, polite, working the night shift. But beneath that unremarkable exterior was a man who would become known as the Jar's murderer, a name that still makes people shudder when they hear it. Lam was born in British Hong Kong in 1955. His childhood was marked by brutal violence at the hands of his father, who beat him and his mother so severely that young Lam was once knocked unconscious. The family moved from Malaysia to Hong Kong when Lam was a teenager, and while the physical abuse stopped, the psychological damage was already done. He struggled to make friends, found solace in his electronic chess set, and grew into an adult who was completely isolated from the world around him. By 1980, Lam had become a night shift taxi driver, a job that perfectly suited his temperament and his need for solitude. He lived with his family in To Kwa Wan, sharing a room with his younger brother. He had never had a girlfriend. He had never really connected with anyone. But what his family didn't know was that Lam had developed a secret obsession with pornography, ordering magazines from Britain because he was too embarrassed to buy them locally. He would photograph the images and develop them himself, creating his own private collection that he kept locked away in a metal ammunition box. But like so many serial killers, Lam's fantasies eventually stopped being enough. He bought a Polaroid camera and began taking pictures of women in public restrooms, sneaking under cubicle doors to capture voyeuristic images. When women noticed and chased him, he would run, but he was getting tired of running. He wanted something more. On February 3rd, 1982, Lam picked up a passenger named Chan Fung Lan outside the Chinese Palace nightclub in Sim Sha Tsui. She was drunk, having just finished work, and asked him to stop the car so she could vomit. After she got back in, she kept changing her mind about where she wanted to go. First home, then back to Sim Sha Tsui, then somewhere else. That's when something inside Lam snapped. He stopped the car, took an electrical wire, and strangled her to death. What happened next shows just how calculated and methodical Lam was. He drove home with the body still in his taxi, dragged it past the sleeping security guard, and hid it under his sofa. He waited for his family to wake up and leave for work. Then he laid Chan's body on his plastic-covered bedroom floor and used an electric saw to dismember her. He photographed everything, documenting each step of the process like it was a science experiment. He wrapped the body parts and threw them into the Shingmun River. A week later, when news reports mentioned body parts washing up on the riverbanks, Lam felt a thrill of satisfaction. The police had no idea who had done it. He had gotten away with murder. But Lam wasn't finished. Over the next few months, he would kill 3 more women, all following the same pattern. He would pick them up in his taxi, strangle them, bring them home, and dismember them during the day while his family was at work. His brother, who shared the same bedroom, never suspected a thing. Lam worked nights, so he had the house to himself during the day. What made Lam particularly disturbing was what he did with parts of his victims. He carefully preserved their genitalia in jars filled with formaldehyde, creating a grotesque collection that he kept hidden in his room. This wasn't just about murder for Lam. It was about possession, about keeping something of his victims forever. The meticulous way he disposed of the bodies showed a level of planning that was genuinely chilling. He would drive to remote locations in the new territories and on Hong Kong Island, scattering body parts in different locations to make identification difficult. He thought he had covered his tracks perfectly, but like so many serial killers, Lam's arrogance eventually led to his downfall. He had been photographing his victims during the dismemberment process, and when he took these films to a Kodak shop for development, a technician noticed something wasn't right. The images were too graphic, too disturbing to be anything other than evidence of serious crimes. On August 18th, 1982, two plainclothes police officers arrested Lamb based on the tip from the photo technician. When they searched his home, they found a house of horrors. There were the jars containing preserved body parts, photographs documenting his crimes, and evidence linking him to all four murders. The case shocked Hong Kong. This was the territory's first known serial killer, and the details were so gruesome that only men were allowed to serve on the jury. A female forensic scientist was removed from the case because the evidence was considered too disturbing. Lam was initially sentenced to death, but the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment without parole. He's now 67 years old, serving his sentence at the maximum security Shek Pik prison on Lantau Island. What makes Lamb's case so terrifying is how ordinary he seemed. He was just another taxi driver, quiet and unremarkable, living with his family and working the night shift. His victims trusted him enough to get into his taxi. They had no idea they were climbing into a vehicle with a man who had already killed and dismembered other women. The case also highlighted something disturbing about urban anonymity. In a city like Hong Kong, with millions of people living in close proximity, it's possible for someone to commit horrific crimes while living a seemingly normal life. Lam shared a bedroom with his brother, ate dinner with his family, and went to work every day. None of them suspected that he was one of the most dangerous men in Hong Kong. Our final killer takes us back to the American landscape, but this time we're dealing with someone whose crimes spanned multiple states and terrorized communities across the country. Angel Maturino Resendez was known as the Railroad Killer, and his method of transportation made him one of the most elusive serial killers in American history. Resendez was born in Mexico and illegally entered the United States dozens of times. He would hop freight trains and travel across the country, getting off whenever he saw an opportunity to kill. His victims were found near railroad tracks, brutally beaten to death with whatever blunt objects he could find: rocks, pickaxes, sledgehammers. He preferred to use items he found in the victims' own homes, turning their personal belongings into weapons. What made Resendez particularly dangerous was his mobility. While other serial killers operated in specific geographic areas, Resendez could be anywhere the railroad went. He would commit a murder in Texas, then hop a train and kill someone in Kentucky a few days later. Police departments in different states had no idea they were dealing with the same killer. The FBI eventually linked him to at least 15 murders across 6 states between 1986 and 1999. His victims ranged from college students to elderly couples, but they all shared one thing in common: they lived near railroad tracks. Resendez would scout out homes close to the railway, break in during the night, and attack anyone he found inside. The brutality of his attacks was shocking. He would beat his victims to death with savage intensity, often striking them dozens of times. But after the killing, something strange would happen. Resendez would linger in the homes, sometimes for hours. He would eat food from the refrigerator, shower, and go through the victims' personal belongings. He would study their driver's licenses, learning about their lives. He would take jewelry and sentimental items, but often left money behind. This wasn't random violence, it was ritualistic. A psychiatrist who examined Resendiz later testified that he was a paranoid schizophrenic who believed he was an angel sent by God to kill evil people. He thought he was carrying out divine justice, cleansing the world of sinners. The case that brought Resendiz national attention involved two college students, Christopher Meyer and Holly Dunn. On August 28, 1997, the couple was walking along railroad tracks in Lexington, Kentucky, when Resendiz attacked them. He killed Meyer with a rock, then sexually assaulted and severely beat Dunn, leaving her for dead. But Dunn survived, despite having a shattered jaw, a fractured eye socket, and multiple cuts to her face and head. She managed to crawl to safety and provide police with a description of her attacker. Her testimony would prove crucial in eventually bringing Resendiz to justice. The manhunt for the railroad killer became one of the largest in FBI history. Resendiz had been deported from the United States 8 times in a single year, but he kept coming back. On June 1st, 1999, he was actually in the custody of Border Patrol agents, but no one checked his fingerprints, so he was released. He went on to commit 4 more murders after that. Finally, in 1999, Resendiz's sister convinced him to turn himself in. He surrendered to authorities and was eventually convicted of multiple murders. He was executed by lethal injection in 2006. What made Resendiz so terrifying was his unpredictability. Unlike other serial killers who had specific victim types or geographic patterns, he could strike anywhere, anytime. The sound of a train whistle became a source of fear for people living near railroad tracks across the American South and Midwest. These 5 killers, Rogers, Kumar, Hughes, Lamb, and Resendiz, represent different faces of evil, but they all share common traits. They were able to blend into society, appearing normal on the surface while harboring dark fantasies and violent impulses. They targeted vulnerable people who couldn't fight back or wouldn't be missed quickly, and they all believed in their own twisted ways that they had the right to take human lives. What's most disturbing about these cases is how they reveal the thin line between civilization and savagery. These weren't monsters hiding in the shadows. They were mechanics, teachers, taxi drivers, and drifters. They lived among us, worked alongside us, and in some cases were trusted members of their communities. The evil they carried was invisible until it was too late. Their stories serve as a reminder that predators come in all forms, and that the most dangerous ones are often those who seem the most ordinary. They understood how to exploit trust, how to identify vulnerability, and how to disappear back into the crowd after committing their crimes. We've explored how seemingly ordinary individuals can harbor unimaginable evil, targeting society's most vulnerable while maintaining facades of normalcy. But perhaps no case demonstrates this deception more chillingly than that of Hong Kong's first documented serial killer, a man whose crimes were so disturbing that authorities had to shield female forensic scientists from the evidence and restrict jury selection to men only. Lam Kor Wan was born in British Hong Kong on May 22, 1955, initially named Lam Kwok Yue. His early years were marked by brutal domestic violence that would forever shape his psyche. Growing up in Malaysia, Lam endured savage beatings from his father, violence so severe it once knocked him unconscious. His mother suffered the same fate, creating a household where terror was the norm. The abuse only ceased when the family relocated to Hong Kong during Lam's teenage years, but the psychological damage was already carved deep into his developing mind. As a child, Lam was profoundly isolated. While other children formed friendships and social bonds, his closest companion was an electronic chess set. This early withdrawal from human connection would prove prophetic. At school, he struggled to make friends, retreating further into himself with each failed social interaction. The pattern of isolation that began in childhood would define his entire adult existence. In 1978, Lam obtained a taxi license and officially changed his name to Lam Korwan, marking the beginning of his professional life as a cab driver. By 1980, he had settled into the night shift, a decision that perfectly suited both his antisocial temperament and his growing dark appetites. The cover of darkness and the anonymity of late-night passengers would soon become the perfect hunting ground for his twisted desires. Despite being well into adulthood, Lam remained trapped in adolescence, sharing a bedroom with his younger brother in the family home in To Kwa Wan. He had never experienced romantic relationships, never formed intimate connections with another human being. This sexual and emotional isolation festered into something far more sinister as he entered his mid-20s. In 1981, Lam discovered photography, a hobby that would soon transform into an obsession and eventually into the documentation of unspeakable horrors. He threw himself into learning photographic techniques, even joining a photography club where he interacted with other enthusiasts. But behind this seemingly innocent interest lay a growing fascination with pornography and voyeuristic behavior that would escalate into murder. Lam's descent into deviance began with what seemed like harmless activities. He secretly amassed a collection of pornographic magazines ordered from Britain, too embarrassed to purchase them locally. These materials were locked away in a metal ammunition box, hidden from his family, who shared the cramped living space. But simply viewing these images wasn't enough. He began rephotographing the pictures, finding excitement in the process of capturing and recreating sexual imagery. The thrill of static images soon lost its appeal, driving Lam to seek more immediate and dangerous gratification. Armed with a Polaroid camera, he began stalking women in public restrooms, taking photographs from beneath toilet cubicle doors. When victims noticed and chased him through the streets, rather than deterring him, these close calls only added to the excitement. The risk became part of the rush. But even this escalation couldn't satisfy his growing appetite for control and violation. By early 1982, Lam had grown tired of running from angry victims and security guards. He craved something more permanent, more complete. The stage was set for the emergence of Hong Kong's most notorious serial killer. On February 3rd, 1982, Lam's violent fantasies finally erupted into deadly reality. Working his usual night shift, he picked up a passenger named Chan Fung Lan around 4 in the morning. The woman had just finished work at the Chinese Palace nightclub in Tsim Sha Tsui and had been drinking with her sister and friends. Heavily intoxicated, she asked Lam to stop the car so she could vomit, then requested to be taken back to Tsim Sha Tsui, only to change her mind again minutes later. This simple act of indecision triggered something explosive in Lam's mind. Years of pent-up rage, sexual frustration, and violent fantasies converged in that moment. He stopped the car, grabbed an electrical wire, and strangled the drunk woman to death. In that instant, Chan Fung Lan became the first victim of Hong Kong's most disturbed killer, though her death was merely the beginning of a reign of terror that would shock even hardened investigators. What followed reveals the calculated, methodical nature of Lam's psychopathy. Rather than panicking or attempting to dispose of the body immediately, he drove home with Chan Feng Lan's corpse still in his taxi. With chilling composure, he dragged her body into his family's flat, past the sleeping security guard, and concealed it under his sofa. He then waited patiently for his family members to wake up and leave for their daily routines. Once alone, Lam moved the body to his plastic-covered bedroom floor. Using an electric saw, he methodically dismembered Chan Feng Lan while his camera captured every gruesome detail. This wasn't a frenzied attack or a moment of temporary insanity. This was the careful work of a man who had found his true calling. He wrapped the body parts with surgical precision and disposed of them in the Xingmun River. Within a week, news reports began surfacing about body parts washing up along the riverbanks, but authorities had no suspects and couldn't even identify the victim. Lam had committed the perfect crime, or so it seemed, but for him, perfection wasn't enough. The killing had awakened something insatiable. Over the following months, Lam refined his technique and expanded his victim count. He developed a systematic approach to murder that demonstrated both intelligence and complete moral vacancy. Working the night shift allowed him to identify vulnerable targets while maintaining his cover as a hardworking taxi driver. His shared bedroom arrangement meant he had to be incredibly careful about timing, but it also provided the perfect alibi. Who would suspect a man living under such close family scrutiny? The forensic evidence of Lam's crimes tells a story of escalating depravity. After each murder, he would meticulously dismember his victims, photographing the process for his personal collection. These trophies weren't hidden away in some remote location. They were kept in his family home, stored alongside his photography equipment, while his relatives went about their daily lives completely unaware. The psychological profile that emerges from Lam's case is particularly chilling because of how he compartmentalized his existence. By day, he was a quiet, unremarkable man living with his family. By night, he was a predator stalking Hong Kong's streets. His ability to maintain this dual existence for months demonstrates a level of psychological control that made him incredibly dangerous. Lam's downfall came not through brilliant detective work, but through a simple mistake that reveals how even the most careful criminals can be undone by mundane details. After months of perfect crimes, he made the fatal error of taking his film to a Kodak shop for development. The photo technician, processing what he initially thought were medical or educational photographs, quickly realized he was looking at something far more sinister. The images showed explicit documentation of torture, murder, and dismemberment. On August 18, 1982, two plainclothes police officers arrested Lam Korwan based on the tip from the photo technician. When they searched his family home, they discovered a chamber of horrors that defied comprehension. The formaldehyde-filled jars containing victims' body parts, the extensive photographic documentation of murders, and the meticulous records of his crimes painted a picture of systematic evil that shocked even experienced investigators. During his interrogation, Lam showed no remorse, no regret, no recognition of the horror he had inflicted. He discussed his crimes with the same detached professionalism he might use to describe his taxi routes. This complete absence of human empathy, combined with his methodical approach to murder, marked him as one of the most dangerous psychopaths in Hong Kong's criminal history. The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented in Hong Kong's judicial system. The evidence was so disturbing that authorities made the unusual decision to bar women from serving on the jury and remove female forensic scientists from the case. Even hardened male professionals found the details of Lam's crimes difficult to process. Initially sentenced to death, Lam's punishment was later commuted to life imprisonment without parole by the Hong Kong governor. Today, at 68 years old, he remains incarcerated at the maximum security Shek Pik prison on Lantau Island, where he will spend the remainder of his life behind bars. The case of Lam Kor Wan represents something uniquely terrifying in the annals of criminal history. Unlike killers driven by rage, greed, or desperation, Lam murdered for the pure satisfaction of exercising absolute control over another human being. His crimes weren't crimes of passion or necessity. They were the calculated actions of a man who had reduced other human beings to objects for his personal gratification. What makes his case particularly disturbing is how successfully he maintained his facade of normalcy. His family, his photography club associates, even his taxi passengers, had no idea they were interacting with one of Hong Kong's most dangerous predators. He proved that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it rides beside you in a taxi, quiet and polite, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The Jars murderer case forever changed how Hong Kong authorities approach serial crime investigation. It demonstrated that even in a densely populated city with extensive family networks, a determined killer could operate undetected for extended periods. Lam's ability to hide his crimes in plain sight, literally keeping evidence in a shared family home, showed that proximity doesn't guarantee protection. Today, Lam Kor Wan serves as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most ordinary. What makes these cases so deeply disturbing isn't just the brutality of the crimes, but how each killer operated with a calculated precision that suggests something far more sinister than random violence. These weren't heat-of-the-moment murders or crimes of passion. These were methodical, ritualistic acts carried out by individuals who had perfected their techniques over time. Take Dayton Leroy Rogers, for instance. The man they called the Malala Forest murderer didn't just kill his victims and dispose of them. He had developed an entire system. Rogers would cruise the streets of Portland, Oregon, looking for vulnerable women, street workers, addicts, runaways, anyone society had already forgotten. He'd offer them drugs, money, whatever they needed to get into his truck. Then he'd drive them deep into the forest outside Malala, to locations he'd already scouted, places where screams wouldn't carry and bodies wouldn't be found for months. But here's what makes Rogers particularly chilling. He wasn't just disposing of evidence, he was creating a signature. At every crime scene, investigators found the same thing: empty mini bottles of vodka mixed with orange juice. Rogers was making himself screwdrivers while he tortured and killed women. He'd sit there sipping his drink, taking his time. The forensic evidence showed he used hacksaws to dismember some victims, and the tool marks on the bones matched perfectly to a hacksaw found in his possession. He burned clothing in his wood stove at home, but not all of it. Some fabric remnants were found mixed with the ashes, as if he wanted to keep trophies. Rogers was married, had a child, worked as a small engine mechanic. His neighbors described him as quiet, helpful, ordinary. He'd fix their lawnmowers, wave hello in the morning, attend school events for his kid. Nobody suspected that this unremarkable man was methodically hunting women in the forests of Oregon. The duality is what's so terrifying. Rogers could switch between being a suburban dad and a calculating killer without missing a beat. His downfall came not from careful police work, but from his own escalating arrogance. On a bright afternoon in November, Rogers attacked his final victim, Jennifer Lisa Smith, in broad daylight in a parking lot off McLaughlin Boulevard. Witnesses watched in horror as he stabbed her 11 times in the chest, abdomen, and back. When she collapsed, bystanders ran to their cars, trying to block his escape route. But Rogers simply drove over the landscaping and sped away at over 100 miles per hour. One witness followed him through multiple cities: Milwaukee, Gladstone, Oregon City, Canby, maintaining pursuit until Rogers pulled into a driveway. That address led police directly to him. When they searched his home, they found a treasure trove of evidence linking him to at least 6 murders. Blood evidence, victims' belongings, and that hacksaw with bone fragments still embedded in the teeth. But Rogers' case reveals something even more disturbing about the nature of these killers. He was sentenced to death 3 separate times, and 3 times the Oregon Supreme Court overturned his sentence. Each time, he was retried, reconvicted, and sentenced to death again. It wasn't until 2022 that Governor Kate Brown commuted all death sentences in Oregon to life without parole. Rogers had spent decades on death row, knowing exactly what he'd done, never showing remorse, never explaining why he chose those particular women or those particular locations in the forest. The psychological profile that emerged during his trials painted a picture of a man who viewed women as disposable objects. He targeted the most vulnerable because they were easy prey, but also because he believed society wouldn't miss them. Rogers understood the system well enough to know that missing sex workers and drug addicts don't generate the same police attention as missing college students or suburban mothers. He was hunting in the shadows, preying on women who were already invisible to most people. What's particularly haunting is how Rogers almost got away with it for so long. Between 1987 and 1987, he killed at least 6 women and dumped their bodies in remote forest locations. The remains were so scattered and decomposed by the time they were found that connecting them to a single killer took years. If Rogers hadn't become overconfident, if he hadn't attacked Jennifer Smith in broad daylight with witnesses around, he might have continued killing indefinitely. The Molalla Forest still holds secrets. During Rogers' confession, he hinted at their other locations, other victims. Some remains were never recovered. Some women who disappeared during that period were never found. Rogers took those secrets with him to prison, and they'll likely die with him. The forest outside Molalla became a graveyard, and Rogers was its caretaker, returning again and again to the same remote locations where he knew the bodies would decompose, undisturbed. Today, Rogers sits in Two Rivers Correctional Institution in Umatilla, Oregon. He's in his 70s now, a gray-haired old man who spends his days in a cell, reading, sleeping, existing. Guards describe him as polite, quiet, no trouble. He follows the rules, keeps to himself, never causes problems. It's the same facade he maintained for years while living his double life as a suburban mechanic and forest killer. Even now, locked away from society, Rogers continues to demonstrate the same chilling ability to appear completely normal while harboring the darkest impulses imaginable. The case of Dayton Leroy Rogers forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of evil. It doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it lives next door, fixes your lawnmower, and waves hello every morning. Sometimes it has a family, pays taxes, and blends seamlessly into the fabric of ordinary life. Looking at these crimes from a psychological perspective, what emerges is perhaps even more disturbing than the murders themselves. Each of these killers demonstrates a level of calculation and self-awareness that defies simple explanations of madness or momentary rage. They weren't driven by passion or desperation. They were methodical architects of suffering who understood exactly what they were doing and chose to continue anyway. Take Dayton Leroy Rogers, who lived a double life so convincing that even his own family had no idea. By day, he was a struggling mechanic, a husband, a father dealing with debt and everyday problems. By night, he transformed into something else entirely. The forensic evidence that finally connected him to his crimes reads like a textbook on criminal investigation. Blood serology linking victims to his knife, fabric analysis matching burned clothing remnants in his wood stove to victims' garments, tool marks on dismembered bones that perfectly matched his hacksaw, hair samples from his truck that belonged to multiple victims. But perhaps most chilling was his ritual. Rogers didn't just kill these women, he took them deep into the Oregon forests, tied them up, and performed what can only be described as ceremonies of control. The mini bottles of vodka mixed with orange juice weren't just his drink of choice, they became part of his signature, found at multiple crime scenes, like calling cards left by a predator who wanted to be known for his work. Even when his death sentence was overturned 3 separate times by the Oregon Supreme Court, Rogers remained unrepentant. He understood the system, understood the appeals process, and simply waited. When Governor Kate Brown commuted all death sentences in Oregon to life without parole in 2022, Rogers had already spent decades behind bars, and by all accounts, he adapted to prison life with the same cold efficiency he'd brought to murder. The case of Mohan Kumar reveals how easily trust can become a weapon in the wrong hands. Kumar wasn't some obvious predator lurking in shadows. He was a primary school teacher, educated and respected in his community. Parents trusted him with their children. Society saw him as a pillar of moral authority. But Kumar had identified a vulnerability in the social fabric and learned to exploit it with devastating precision. His victims were women seeking marriage, seeking better lives, seeking escape from poverty or family situations that offered them little hope. Kumar's methodology was insidious because it exploited one of humanity's most basic needs, the desire for love and security. He would spend weeks or even months building relationships with these women, gaining their complete trust, convincing them to cut ties with their families and friends. By the time he led them to those bus station restrooms with cyanided tablets disguised as contraceptive pills, they were completely isolated and dependent on him. The 30-minute wait he described, knowing they were dying alone in those restrooms while he collected their belongings, reveals a level of cold calculation that defies comprehension. What makes Kumar's case particularly haunting is how he turned the promise of new life into a guarantee of death. These women died believing they were taking steps toward a better future, toward marriage, toward escape from their circumstances. Instead, they were walking into carefully constructed traps designed by someone who understood their desperation and used it against them. When police found multiple mobile phones and cyanide tablets in his residence, they realized they were dealing with a serial operation that had been running for years with industrial efficiency. Michael Hughes represents a different kind of horror entirely. Where Rogers operated in remote forests and Kumar used deception, Hughes turned murder into performance art in the urban landscape of Los Angeles. His victims weren't just killed, they were posed, arranged, displayed like grotesque sculptures meant to shock whoever discovered them. Former LAPD detective Cliff Shepard's observation that Hughes was trying to shock whoever finds the body reveals the theatrical nature of these crimes. Hughes operated during one of the most dangerous periods in Los Angeles history, when the crack epidemic had forced countless women onto the streets as prostitutes to feed their addictions. As many as 90 women were killed in inner-city Los Angeles during that time by multiple serial killers who were hunting simultaneously. Hughes distinguished himself from the others through his staging methods and his brazen confidence. The shopping cart incident that led to his capture demonstrates both his audacity and his eventual downfall. Pushing Jamie Harrington's bound corpse through a Culver City parking lot in broad daylight wasn't just careless. It was an act of supreme arrogance by someone who believed he was untouchable. The DNA evidence that later connected Hughes to additional murders spanning from 1986 to 1993 reveals the true scope of his activities. 15-year-old Yvonne Coleman, found in an Inglewood park. 36-year-old Verna Williams, discovered in a stairwell. 32-year-old Deborah Jackson. Each represents not just a life lost, but a family destroyed, a community terrorized. Hughes's ability to remain undetected for so long, to kill across multiple jurisdictions and time periods, demonstrates the challenges law enforcement faced during this chaotic period in Los Angeles history. Lam Kor Wan's crimes in Hong Kong shocked a society that had never encountered anything like him before. The fact that a female forensic scientist had to be removed from the case and only men were allowed to serve on the jury speaks to the extreme nature of what investigators discovered. Lam wasn't just Hong Kong's first serial killer. He was something unprecedented in their criminal justice system. The psychological profile that emerges from Lam's background is textbook in its progression from abuse to isolation to violence. The childhood beatings that left him unconscious. The social isolation that made an electronic chess set his closest friend. The progression from pornography to voyeurism to murder. What makes Lam's case particularly disturbing is how he managed to carry out his crimes while sharing a bedroom with his brother and living under the same roof as his parents. The logistics alone are staggering. After strangling Chan Fung Lan in his taxi, Lam dragged her corpse past a sleeping security guard, kept it under his sofa until his family left for work, then spent the day dismembering her body on his plastic-covered bedroom floor while photographing everything. The preserved genitalia kept in formaldehyde-filled jars weren't just trophies. They were part of an elaborate ritual that satisfied some twisted psychological need for control and possession. When the Kodak photo technician who processed Lamb's film finally reported him to police, investigators found themselves dealing with evidence unlike anything in Hong Kong's criminal history: the makeshift darkroom, the photographs documenting every stage of his crimes, the careful preservation of body parts. Lam had created a comprehensive archive of his activities, suggesting someone who not only enjoyed what he was doing, but wanted to be able to relive it indefinitely. Angel Maturino Resendiz represents perhaps the most terrifying type of serial killer, one who is completely mobile and essentially invisible to traditional law enforcement methods. The fact that he had been deported 8 times in a single year, including being released by Border Patrol just hours before committing additional murders, reveals the complete failure of the system to deal with someone who existed outside normal social structures. Resendez's method of using freight trains as both transportation and target selection made him nearly impossible to track. He would hop off trains in small communities, identify vulnerable victims living near railroad tracks, commit his crimes, then disappear back into the vast network of railways that crisscross America. His victims were chosen not for any personal connection or specific characteristic, but simply because they were accessible and isolated. The psychiatric evaluation that described Resendiz as believing himself to be an angel avenging God by killing people he believed were evil provides insight into his psychological state, but it doesn't diminish the calculated nature of his crimes. He specifically targeted victims who couldn't overpower him due to his small stature. He took time to study their driver's licenses and learn about their lives. He stole sentimental items and jewelry, giving them to his wife and mother in Mexico. This wasn't random violence driven by delusion. It was systematic predation with a thin veneer of religious justification. The case of Christopher Meyer and Holly Dunn illustrates both the randomness and the brutality of Resendez's attacks. 2 college students walking back from a party, following railroad tracks in what should have been a safe college town environment. The fact that Holly Dunn survived despite being raped, beaten, and left for dead speaks to both her incredible strength and sheer luck. Her testimony became crucial to the prosecution's case, but the trauma she endured represents the lasting damage these crimes inflict on survivors and communities. What unites all 5 of these killers is their ability to exploit the fundamental assumptions that allow society to function. We assume that teachers care about their students, that taxi drivers will take us safely to our destinations, that mechanics and neighbors are basically decent people. These killers understood those assumptions and weaponized them. They didn't just commit murder. They violated the basic social contracts that make civilization possible. The investigation and prosecution of these cases also reveal how forensic science and law enforcement techniques evolved to meet new challenges. The DNA evidence that connected Michael Hughes to additional murders years after his initial conviction, the international cooperation required to track Angel Maturino Resendez across multiple countries, the psychological profiling techniques developed to understand killers like Lam Korwan. Each case pushed the boundaries of what investigators thought they knew about criminal behavior. But perhaps most importantly, these cases demonstrate that evil rarely announces itself. It doesn't wear a mask or carry a sign. More often, it drives a taxi, teaches children, fixes engines, or rides freight trains across the country. It lives next door, shares family dinners, and maintains the appearance of normalcy while planning the next attack. The monsters we should fear most aren't the obvious ones. They're the ones who have learned to hide in plain sight, using our trust and our assumptions about human decency as weapons against us. These 5 men prove that the most dangerous predators are often the ones we never see coming. Imagine standing at the edge of a railroad track in the dead of night, feeling the metal vibrate beneath your feet as a freight train thunders past in the darkness. For most of us, that's just the background noise, the industrial heartbeat of America moving goods from one coast to another. But for Angel Maturino Resendiz, those rails weren't just transportation, they were hunting grounds. Every whistle in the distance, every rumble of steel on steel, was another opportunity to disappear, to strike, and to vanish like smoke into the American landscape. Angel Maturino Resendiz wasn't your typical serial killer. He didn't have a lair, didn't keep trophies in his basement, didn't even have a basement. What he had was something far more terrifying: complete mobility. The entire United States railroad system became his weapon of choice, allowing him to hop on and off freight trains at will, striking in small towns and suburbs before disappearing into the night like a ghost. The FBI would eventually call him the Railroad Killer, and at one point, he was their most wanted fugitive. But before he became a household name, before the headlines and the manhunt, he was just another shadow riding the rails. Born in Mexico in 1959, Angel grew up in poverty in the state of Durango. His early life was marked by abandonment and neglect. His father left when he was young, and his mother struggled to care for him and his siblings. By his teens, Angel was already crossing illegally into the United States, drawn by the promise of work and money. But legitimate work was hard to come by for someone without papers, without connections, without a permanent address. So he learned to survive in the shadows, hopping freight trains, sleeping rough, and taking whatever he could get. The railroad system became his university. He learned which trains ran which routes, which cars were easiest to hide in, which towns had the loosest security. He could read the rails like a map, knowing that a westbound Union Pacific would take him to California, while an eastbound BNSF might land him in Texas or Louisiana. This knowledge made him incredibly dangerous because it made him unpredictable. Traditional police work relies on patterns, on geographic profiling, on the assumption that killers operate within familiar territory. But Angel's territory was the entire continental United States. His first confirmed murder happened in 1986, though investigators believe he may have killed earlier. The victim was 15-year-old Yvonne Coleman, found in a park in Inglewood, California. She had been bludgeoned to death with a blunt object, her skull crushed with such force that detectives initially thought she'd been hit by a car. But the positioning of the body was wrong, the injuries too precise. Someone had beaten this child to death with methodical brutality, then simply walked away. What made Angel's crimes particularly terrifying was his method. He didn't use guns or knives, weapons that might be traced or leave distinctive marks. Instead, he used whatever was at hand: railroad spikes, rocks, hammers, pickaxes, household items he found in his victims' own homes. The violence was always brutal, always focused on the head and face, as if he was trying to erase his victims' identities, along with their lives. A psychiatrist would later testify that Angel believed himself to be an avenging angel, sent by God to eliminate people he considered evil or immoral. But there was method to his madness. Angel was surprisingly careful about victim selection. Despite his small stature, he managed to overpower his targets through surprise and the sheer savagery of his attacks. He avoided large victims who might fight back effectively. He targeted people who lived alone, often near railroad tracks, often in homes that offered easy escape routes back to the rails. He would sometimes spend days or even weeks watching potential victims, learning their routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The pattern that would define his killing spree began to emerge in the 1990s. Angel would hop off a freight train in some small town or suburb, scout the area for suitable victims, then strike with overwhelming violence. After each murder, he would linger in the victim's home, sometimes for hours. He would eat their food, shower, rest, even do laundry. He treated these crime scenes like hotels, casual stopping points in his endless journey across America. He would steal jewelry and valuable items, mailing them back to his wife and mother in Mexico, or selling them for quick cash. One of the most chilling aspects of his crimes was how he would arrange his victims' driver's licenses and personal documents after killing them. Investigators found that he would study these items, learning about the people he had just murdered, names, addresses, birth dates, the mundane details of lives cut short. Some experts believe this ritual was part of his delusion that he was serving as God's instrument, judging the worthiness of his victims even after death. The case that would eventually bring Angel national attention involved two college students in Texas. Christopher Meyer, 21, and his girlfriend Holly Dunn, 20, were walking along railroad tracks near their university when they encountered Angel. It was late at night, and they were returning from a party, taking what they thought was a safe shortcut. Angel emerged from the shadows and attacked them with a railroad spike. Christopher fought back, trying to protect Holly, but Angel's fury was overwhelming. He bludgeoned Christopher to death with savage efficiency, then turned his attention to Holly. He raped her, beat her with the railroad spike, and left her for dead next to the tracks. But Holly survived. Despite a shattered jaw, a fractured eye socket, and severe head trauma, she managed to crawl to safety and call for help. Her survival would prove crucial to Angel's eventual capture and conviction. Holly's testimony revealed the cold calculation behind Angel's apparent madness. He had spoken to them before the attack, asking casual questions about their lives, their plans. He seemed almost normal, just another drifter asking for directions or spare change. Then, without warning, he exploded into violence. Holly described how he seemed to transform, as if something inside him had switched off his humanity and turned on something monstrous. The FBI's investigation revealed the true scope of Angel's crimes. Between 1986 and 1999, he was linked to at least 15 murders across 6 states. The victims ranged in age from a 26-year-old woman in Kentucky to an 81-year-old man in Illinois. What connected them wasn't geography or demographics, but proximity to railroad tracks. Every single victim lived within walking distance of active rail lines. The manhunt for Angel became one of the largest in FBI history. His photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country and into Mexico. The agency offered a substantial reward for information leading to his capture, but Angel remained elusive, protected by his mobility and his knowledge of the rail system. Every time authorities thought they were closing in, he would simply hop another train and vanish. What finally brought him down wasn't superior police work or forensic science, but family pressure. As the manhunt intensified, Angel's relatives in Mexico began to fear for their own safety. His sister, who had been receiving stolen jewelry and money from him for years, convinced him to surrender. In July 1999, Angel walked across the border and turned himself in to Texas Rangers, ending one of the most wide-ranging serial killing sprees in American history. During his interrogation, Angel showed no remorse for his crimes. He spoke matter-of-factly about the murders, describing them as necessary acts of divine justice. He claimed that God had chosen him to eliminate sinners and moral degenerates from the earth. When asked about Christopher Meyer, the young man he had beaten to death, Angel shrugged and said the victim had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The trial revealed disturbing details about Angel's mental state. Defense psychiatrists diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, claiming he genuinely believed he was carrying out God's will. But prosecutors argued that his careful victim selection, his methodical disposal of evidence, and his ability to evade capture for over a decade proved he was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. In May 2000, Angel Maturino Resendiz was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. He was executed by lethal injection in June 2006, finally ending a killing spree that had terrorized communities across America. His last words were a rambling statement about angels and divine justice, maintaining his delusion to the very end. The railroad killer case changed how law enforcement approaches crimes that cross multiple jurisdictions. Angel's ability to commit murders hundreds of miles apart, sometimes within days of each other, highlighted the need for better communication and coordination between agencies. His crimes also led to increased security around railroad yards and better monitoring of transient populations. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Angel's crimes was the reminder of how vulnerable we all are to random violence. His victims weren't involved in dangerous lifestyles or risky behaviors. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives who had the misfortune to cross paths with a predator who saw murder as a religious calling. Holly Dunn's survival became a testament to human resilience. She spent years in therapy, underwent multiple surgeries, and struggled with the trauma of that night by the railroad tracks. But she also became an advocate for other crime victims, speaking publicly about her experience and working to improve victim services. Her courage in facing Angel in court helped secure his conviction and brought closure to the families of his other victims. The railroad tracks that Angel used as his highway of death still carry freight trains across America every day, but they also serve as a reminder that evil can travel, that predators can emerge from the shadows when we least expect them, and that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who hide in plain sight, moving through our world like passengers on a train we never see coming. Angel Maturino Resendiz proved that evil doesn't need a fixed address or a permanent base of operations. All it needs is opportunity, mobility, and the willingness to destroy innocent lives for its own twisted purposes. These 5 killers represent some of the most chilling examples of predators who operated in plain sight, each perfecting their own methodical approach to evil. What makes their stories even more disturbing is how they exploited the very foundations of human trust and societal structure. Angel Maturino Resendiz, known as the Railroad Killer, turned America's vast railway system into his personal hunting ground. Between the late 1980s and 1999, he illegally hopped freight trains across the country, targeting victims who lived near railroad tracks. His method was as simple as it was terrifying. He would jump off trains, find isolated homes close to the rails, and break in while families slept. Resendiz killed at least 15 people with rocks, pickaxes, and whatever blunt objects he could find in the victims' homes. What made him particularly dangerous was his mobility and the randomness of his strikes. He could commit a murder in Texas, then be hundreds of miles away in Kentucky by the next day, making him nearly impossible to track. The railroad killer wasn't just brutal, he was methodical in his own twisted way. After each murder, he would linger in the homes, eating the victims' food, studying their driver's licenses to learn about their lives, and stealing jewelry and sentimental items to give to his wife and mother back in Mexico. He believed he was an angel of God, avenging sins by killing people he deemed evil. The case that brought him the most attention involved college students Christopher Meyer and Holly Dunn. In August 1997, the young couple was walking along railroad tracks in Kentucky when Resendiz attacked them. He killed Meyer with a rock and brutally assaulted Dunn, leaving her for dead with a shattered jaw, fractured eye socket, and numerous cuts. Miraculously, Dunn survived and became the star witness in his trial. What's most chilling about Resendiz is how the system failed to stop him repeatedly. Police learned he had illegally crossed into the U.S. dozens of times. In 1 year alone, he was deported 8 times. On June 1st, 1999, he was in Border Patrol custody, but no one checked his fingerprints, so he was released. The FBI says he committed 4 more murders after that. The railroad killer was finally captured in 1999 after a massive manhunt. He was executed by lethal injection in 2006, but not before taking credit for 15 confirmed murders across 6 states. His case exposed the vulnerabilities in America's immigration system and showed how one man's mobility could turn an entire transportation network into a corridor of death. Each of these 5 killers reveals something different about the nature of evil and how it can hide in plain sight. Rogers, the debt-ridden mechanic who turned murder into ritual. Kumar, the respected teacher who weaponized marriage promises. Hughes, the drifter who turned death into performance art. Lam, the taxi driver who collected trophies in jars. And Resendiz, the transient who used trains to outrun justice. What connects them all is their ability to blend into society while harboring the darkest impulses. They weren't the monsters lurking in shadows that we see in horror movies. They were ordinary people with jobs, families, and daily routines. They spoke to neighbors, paid bills, and went about their lives while planning their next kill. The forensic evidence that eventually caught them tells its own story. Rogers left behind many vodka bottles and blood evidence in his truck. Kumar was undone by his victim's mobile phone and the cyanide tablets found in his home. Hughes was spotted pushing a shopping cart with a body, leaving fingerprints that connected him to multiple murders. Lamb's photography hobby led to his capture when a photo technician recognized disturbing images. Resendez's pattern of striking near railroad tracks finally gave investigators the connection they needed. These cases also highlight how certain populations remain vulnerable to predators. Rogers targeted sex workers and addicts. Kumar preyed on women desperate for marriage and financial security. Hughes focused on homeless women during the crack epidemic. Lum chose passengers who were alone and intoxicated. Resendez attacked families in isolated homes near train tracks. In every case, the killers deliberately chose victims they believed wouldn't be missed or whose disappearances wouldn't be immediately investigated. The psychological profiles that emerged during their trials reveal different motivations for murder. Rogers seemed driven by a need for control and ritual. Kumar was motivated by greed and sexual gratification. Hughes appeared to enjoy the shock value of staging his victims. Lamb was collecting trophies and documenting his crimes. Resendez believed he was carrying out divine justice, yet all of them shared common traits: the ability to compartmentalize their crimes, a lack of empathy for their victims, and a chilling capacity to return to normal life after committing murder. What's perhaps most disturbing is how long they were able to operate undetected. Rogers killed for years before a daylight attack led to his capture. Kumar's killing spree lasted from 2003 to 2009. Hughes murdered during one of the most dangerous periods in Los Angeles history when multiple serial killers were active. Lam operated for months in densely populated Hong Kong. Resendez crossed state lines for over a decade, committing murders across the country. Their stories serve as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. It can wear the face of a helpful taxi driver, a marriage-minded teacher, a hard-working mechanic, or a quiet drifter. The most dangerous predators are often those who understand how to exploit our basic human needs for trust, companionship, and security. Today, Rogers remains in prison in Oregon, his death sentence commuted to life without parole. Kumar serves life imprisonment in India after his death sentence was also commuted. Hughes sits on death row in California. Lam continues serving his life sentence in Hong Kong's maximum security prison, and Resendez was executed in 2006, finally paying for his crimes with his life. These 5 killers you've never heard of remind us that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones in our nightmares. They're the ones who walk among us, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature. They prove that evil can exist anywhere, in any form, and that our safety often depends on systems and communities staying vigilant against those who would exploit our most basic human vulnerabilities.